This is the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty to have at least some influence over global health policy failed. Also, the closing arguments in the Trump case in New York is happening today. I'll be updating on that. First, on the pandemic treaty. Folks, the pandemic treaty of the World Health Organization, the WHO, has now officially failed to pass. Remember, they failed a few times before, didn't go through. This is kind of the big one, but it's not really over yet. So the controversial, of course, international treaty, it would have empowered the WHO to take deeper influence over global health policy. Basically, they could, again, carry out investigations in different countries of health crisis or health issues. They could have automatic sanctions of different countries if they refuse to allow those investigations. And of course, be able to an extent, dictate what the policies those countries are. Now, they argue they're not undermining the sovereignty of these nations, but it's not quite like that clear. But look, despite it failing to pass, top members of the WHO, including some of the main ones, they noted during the World Health Assembly, they don't see this as the end. Right now, various officials are commenting that they may have a deal within the next 1 to 2 years. Of course, a lot of that's going to depend on what happens in American politics. But this is the direction things are going right now. Now, Reuters said this. They said the head of the World Health Organization on Monday, this is Tedros, of course, he voiced confidence that countries would one day reach a deal on a pandemic accord after failing to produce an agreement last week, although health officials warned it could take years. Briefly on this, they're changing some of the language, and the changes in language, based on what I'm seeing at least, are really important. Remember, this was promoted as a pandemic treaty. If you have a treaty and it's going to be passed in the United States, you need a 2/3 votes by Congress. They can't just pass an international treaty and have the U.S. agree to it. And of course, U.S. support for the pandemic treaty is one of the major forces driving this. But Biden would have a hard time actually getting it into place and making it solid unless he got Congress on board. An accord is different. An accord can bypass that treaty definition and thereby bypass Congress. And so when they have dropped the name pandemic treaty and they're now saying pandemic accord, that's why it's really important. Back to Reuters, they say negotiations failed to produce a draft deal on Friday for a formal approval by the Assembly this week. It says a senior U.S. administration official said Washington, the United States, remained committed to the process, but estimated another 1 to 2 years of talks. He said, there's a lot of frustration, this woman, and it says a health diplomat said reforms to the process were being considered as well as an extension of between 5 to 24 months. Again, up to 2 years. It notes that negotiations are still ongoing for an update to existing health rules on outbreaks, and negotiators say that a deal is close on that, including on a new tiered system of alerts following criticism that WHO was too slow to declare a COVID emergency. Briefly, I would note the context behind the COVID emergency. Why was the World Health Organization slow to declare a COVID emergency? Well, it was because the Chinese Communist Party was telling them they had things under the control. Remember the previous problem you have with the WHO. Under the Trump administration, they investigated the World Health Organization and found the WHO could not demonstrate clear separation from the Chinese Communist Party. They were basically being accused of an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party in the early days of the outbreak was denying that there was going to be a serious outbreak. They said they had everything under control. They said that lockdowns, mask mandates, and the whole 9 yards worked. And so what happened? After, of course, the virus spread globally because the CCP locked down travel within China, then allowed travel outside of China, thereby seeding the virus to the world, while the WHO denied there was a problem. That allowed the virus to spread. The CCP then bought up personal protective equipment, got a corner on the market, and then used that as a diplomatic tool, where they told countries, if you want the PPE, you have to make deals with the CCP. And then, of course, what happened? Well, the WHO then changed its policies, but also aligned it to CCP messaging. When the CCP wanted economic lockdowns, and they wanted, again, lockdowns for every individual, mask mandates, that was modeled after the Chinese Communist Party's model, but it was done too late. because again, the CCP by that time had already seeded the virus to the world. So really, in my opinion at least, the problem of, again, the WHO declaring a global health emergency a bit late on COVID was not because of the tiered system they had, right, the alert system. It was more because they believed the Chinese Communist Party and what it was saying. And of course, that's what allowed that problem to happen. And remember as well that Donald Trump tried actually locking down travel, making it so that people from China could not travel to the US. And of course, he was attacked as being a racist and a bigot and the whole 9 yards for saying that. But back to the treaty, right, the pandemic treaty. What would it actually do? Well, let me show you what the UK Parliament had to say on it. I should note, remember, the main part with this treaty is that it has not been fully agreed on what it would actually include. And so any discussion on this is kind of just where things are at right now. But UK Parliament said the main goal of this treaty, again, the WHO's pandemic treaty, would be to foster an all-of-government and all-of-society approach, strengthening national, regional, and global capacities and resilience to future pandemics. So it's not only countries agreeing to it, in other words, it also includes, again, it's not just international, it's also national, and it's also local. They're saying it's an all-of-government and even all-of-society approach. I should note that when Tedros was speaking to the World Health Assembly, a lot of the groups there were NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And so this includes kind of a grassroots branch to it as well. This would be all of society. This would be top to bottom and even global. And now this is again the UK government. They say this includes greatly enhancing international cooperation to improve, for example, alert systems, data sharing, research, and local, regional, and global production, and distribution of medical and public health countermeasures such as vaccines, medicines, diagnostics, and personal protective equipment, PPE. And it's further in October of 2021, the Working Group on Strengthening WHO Preparedness for and Response to Health Emergencies, the WGPR, published a zero-draft report outlining an assessment of the benefits of a new WHO convention. This is an agreement or other international instrument on pandemic preparedness and response, it says, for consideration by the World Health Assembly, the thing that just happened. Now, they note that this report, among other things, suggested that such an initiative, quote, could include promoting high-level political commitment and whole-of-government, whole-of-society approaches addressing, get this, equity, enhancing the One Health approach, and strengthening health systems and their resilience. Now, I'd question, what does equity have to do with global health, right? But let me show you a bit more. We'll get into it. This is Tedros, head of the WHO, giving an address to the World Health Assembly just the other day after it was revealed that the pandemic treaty had failed. And I should note that they say that even though it did not pass this time, they're going to keep trying. Watch.
So my wish is we will come out of the assembly re-energized, inspired. We will try everything, believing that anything is possible, and make this happen. Because the world still needs a pandemic treaty, and the world needs to be prepared, because many of the challenges that caused the serious impact during COVID-19 still exist.
Now, look, I should add on this, Tedros, he's talking about the treaty more in terms of COVID-19, right? He's saying, look, the COVID-19 pandemic is still here. Yes, it's not being treated the way it used to be, but it's still a problem. He alleges that like tens of millions of people have died from COVID-19. And he suggests that, that a type of treaty like this is the responsible act to make sure that people are safe and so on, right? But the agreement actually is not just about COVID-19. In fact, of course, the big thing is, the next pandemic, as they call it. How do we prepare for the next pandemic and make sure that the crisis of COVID-19 never happens again? Some of the big loaded words going around, though, if you really read into their documents and really look at what they're saying, the big words going around are, quote, safety and, quote, equity. And when you build an international power, right, the global system that can mandate or at least recommend with threats of sanctions, health policies for countries that are enforced not even just at the top level, but even as a whole of society approach down to the, again, even grassroots and NGO type level. You're dealing with something that's pretty massive. It's an international power, in other words, that can stretch down to the local level of every country that can push for safety and equity globally. And remember that under the label of public health, that can have pretty deep implications. What is safety? Now, when we think of safety, we might think, oh, safe from COVID-19, safe from dengue fever, safe from viruses and things of that sort. Safety, though, does not just include that. Remember, they also label global warming as a global health emergency. They label gun violence as a global health crisis. They label, for example, poverty as being a health crisis. And when you link onto that the narrative of equity and the idea that equity is an element of global health, and they're not just talking about health care, right? This isn't just about providing medical services. When they talk about global health and equity as an extension of, for example, poverty and gun violence and racial inequality and everything else, this represents a system basically that could mandate a type of really global socialism, just to put it plainly. This would mean that, of course, narratives on unequal distribution of goods, unequal distribution of wealth, unequal whatever, would basically be able to be regulated by an international power, by an individual who is a former Marxist, Tedros, right? He was with an Ethiopian communist group, notably. And so when you have an individual who, again, has roots in a communist movement, a very violent one, I should note, and he's taking those ideas and, of course, getting global power under a system that's able to mandate and dictate these types of things, it does bring up some concerns, I think, over whether this could, let's say, go beyond just COVID-19, which is, of course, one of the big problems a lot of people have had with this. Now, the World Health Organization also issued a release after the process, but I'll be going more into that after a quick break, so see you soon.
Experts agree, one of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Hey, welcome back. Now, the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty has now officially failed to pass. The WHO issued a release after the process, but let me show you what they had to say. Watch. Now, this is their official document. They say that countries today ended their resumed 9th meeting of the International Government Negotiating Body, the INB, comprising WHO's 194 member states, most of the world. They note that initial agreement was reached by the INB on multiple elements of the draft agreement and convergence on others. This is important, folks, because what they're saying basically is that these 194 countries, these member states, 194 actually did reach initial agreements on a lot of the different parts of this pandemic treaty, and also, had some convergence on others. But basically, it means that there were elements of it that they did agree should be put into place. There were also areas, it says, though, of non-convergence and divergent views, and of course, that's what derailed the whole thing. Now, it notes that Bureau Co-Chair Mr. Roland Dries of the Netherlands said that the member states remained committed to completing the pandemic agreement process and look forward to the World Health Assembly to consider the progress made on this landmark initiative. Now, they note that, quote, clearly there is agreement among governments that the world must forge a new approach to combating pandemics, according to this individual. And he says, quote, "The next steps in this essential process will now be guided by the World Health Assembly." So what they're saying basically is that they do have some degree of agreement between all the different parties that would need to agree to make this thing pass. But there were a few different points that they did not agree on. So what does that mean? It means that they're going to keep all the things they agreed on probably on the side. And the things they disagreed on, they're going to be revising those and trying to find some middle ground where they can pass it. Meaning, this is back to the point where they said this is not over yet. They're saying 1 year to 2 years, or between 5 and 24 months. I should note there's some wild cards in that, though. The big one, of course, the American elections. It's very possible, based on polling, that Trump could become president again. They're facing this reality. It's very unlikely Donald Trump would support it, because remember, Donald Trump, under his administration, he defunded the WHO. Donald Trump pulled American money out of the World Health Organization because his administration conducted an investigation and they determined that the WHO could not demonstrate independence from the Chinese Communist Party. And because of that, they believed that giving the WHO powers was essentially giving power to the Chinese Communist Party, an adversary to the United States. Based on that, of course, the U.S. stopped listening to the WHO. After Biden came into office, they then, of course, brought money back, U.S. funding back to the WHO, brought the U.S. back into the WHO, and then began the process in 2021 of, again, pushing for the pandemic treaty, which would give essentially, they argue on the extent of it, right? But it would allow the WHO to recommend, with threats of sanctions, different policies for countries to adopt and to carry out investigations. Although remember, it's still being negotiated, so nothing's in stone yet. The other big wild card, aside from Trump coming in and just saying, hey, deal's off, is also that actually a lot of different countries in the world are also having serious political shifts. You're having a lot of different countries electing, I guess you could call them Trump-like figures. And so the global political landscape is shifting right now. It's actually very unpredictable because of that. I should note, though, that one thing I've been surprised about while traveling outside the United States is that the United Nations actually has a lot of influence. And so when you go to countries in Latin America, you go to countries in Asia, actually the United Nations is a pretty major power. Even though in the United States we don't see them like that, we kind of don't really view them as having any actual authority. I think in the U.S. we regard it more as like a diplomatic, get-together, basically. It's not like that in Latin America. It's not like that in Africa. It's not like that in a lot of Asia. It's not even like that in a lot of Europe. The United Nations has a lot of power. And it's not necessarily partisan either, because for a lot of these countries, they see it as how they are able to have a voice within international politics in a system where they believe the U.S. is kind of the main power. And so in the United States, where we kind of, whether we like it or not, we become the world leader, we don't really view it as being that big of a deal. A lot of other countries actually do view it as a very big deal. And so it's a bit of a wild card depending on where the new politicians, if they do come in, are going to fall on the scale of whether or not they recognize the United Nations. On that note, briefly though, you do have some pushing back. For example, in Panama, where I just was doing my documentary, of course, weapons of mass migration. The new president coming in, for example, is actually going to be breaking away. He wants to close down the Darien Gap and begin breaking away from the NGOs that are working as the boots on the ground for the United Nations within the treaty, of course, when it comes to global migration. And so the Global Compact for Migration. And so when you're dealing with this, you do have a lot of these countries believing that their own sovereignty is being undermined, and there's pushback on that. So in other words, they're saying 1 to 2 years, but there's a lot of wild cards involved with this. Now that said, though, the Biden administration has been fairly on board with pushing the treaty, but it's really not so simple to get it implemented. Remember, again, as I briefly mentioned, in the United States, if you pass a treaty, and this is called a treaty, at least it was until now, they're changing the language now, right? But for a treaty to get passed in the United States, for the U.S. government to agree to an international treaty, you need a 2/3 vote by Congress. And even if Biden agreed to the global pandemic treaty or whatever else, it would get challenged. It'd probably get overturned, and it probably would not stand because, again, you need a 2/3 vote for it. Now, technically, the treaty wouldn't have countries ceding power to the WHO, though, and this is where it gets important. One of the big arguments against the treaty where they say, hey, it's right-wing conspiracy theorists who are spreading discord and disinformation to undermine the WHO's benevolent plan. They say that this is not about these countries ceding power to the WHO. Like the WHO is not going to become the king of America, right? Where they can just dictate whatever they want. They'd still technically have their own sovereignty. Every country would still be able to choose whether or not they go along with the recommended policies of the World Health Organization. They would still maintain their sovereignty. They technically would not have to follow the recommendations. But the other side of it, which critics of it has pointed out, is that the treaty would actually have systems in place that give them really serious power. For example, it was even proposed they'd have power to sanction countries if countries don't follow some of the investigations. This is what they referred to as, quote, automatic sanctions. Automatic sanctions. And what this would be essentially, it would lead to automatic sanctions, right? You violate it, it's automatic. There's no process for it, done. If any country impedes or harms WHO investigators, that fail to give information to investigators or don't cooperate with international investigations, they're automatically hit with sanctions. And so, for example, if Tedros decided that, just hypothetically speaking, that he wanted to, for example, look into a global health crisis in America related to gun violence, right? He says gun violence is becoming a public health threat in the United States. And they sent WHO investigators from the United Nations to America to begin looking into gun violence in America. Is it equitable, right? Are there more people of one race or another who are more often the victim of gun crime? In other words, that's when you get into the narrative of equity. Is there a financial disparity? Is it more poor people who are getting killed than rich people? Then they could say, well, based on our investigations, we've determined that there is an unequitable, health crisis taking place in America based on gun violence, and the WHO has come up with new recommendations, maybe ban firearms, or I don't know if they could do that because of our Constitution, but they could say, for example, maybe go after the gun manufacturers or go after ammunition manufacturers or create new different standards to regulate it through, kind of sideline policies. If the United States refused to agree to that, if the United States refused to let the WHO carry out those investigations, then the United States could be hit with automatic sanctions if that process goes into place. Same thing with global warming. Remember, even mass migration right now is being blamed on global warming. If you were to read the New York Times, for example, even going into the Darien Gap, when they write about what's causing the migrant crisis or mass illegal immigration, they're saying that these are climate refugees. These are people fleeing the effects of climate change because they've reinterpreted even climate change into poverty, into being a cause of poverty, into being a cause of racial inequity, into being a cause of gender inequity. And so any element of gender inequity or poverty or racial inequity or anything else can be lumped onto the narrative of climate change. And if they deem that a global health crisis, they can then recommend policies on everything else under it. Now, again, this is all hypothetical because they don't have the powers yet. We've not seen them yet do it. But this is one of the concerns that come about with this treaty and what it would actually represent. Right? This is why a lot of critics are not really happy with this. And these are some of the concerns being raised on why the thing is not passing. Now, the other big issue you're going to have, though, is that they're changing the language. I mentioned briefly that when you're dealing with, for example, a treaty, you need a two-thirds vote by Congress in the United States to pass it. It's not easy, and if they do it, it can be challenged and probably overturned. But now they're not calling it that. They're not calling it a pandemic treaty anymore. This is one of the big shifts that's now taking place. They're now calling it a climate accord. They're now calling it other things, right? And accords, like for example, the Paris Climate Accord, was able to bypass Congress. Treaties, if they call it a, if they call it a treaty, it has other legal implications. But there's a loophole when you define it differently. This was a change we saw happen mainly under Barack Obama during his second term. Because you might remember during Obama's second term in office in the United States, you had the issue that, again, Republicans in the House and Senate were blocking a lot of his initiatives. Republicans had a supermajority for a while, at least within Congress. Even when Trump came into office, technically Republicans had a supermajority, and Republicans were like blocking Trump until a lot of them resigned and the party began going under reforms. But back to the Obama administration, that was a situation. Obama, in his second term, was basically a lame duck president. He couldn't do much. And so as a way of bypassing that, he started using executive orders to bypass Congress. He used executive orders to go around Republicans in Congress because nothing he tried to do would work otherwise. And he found that he could do the same thing, or at least I think it's questionably legal, frankly. I think it could be challenged in the U.S. But he found he could do the same thing in the United States when it came to treaties. And so rather than call international agreements treaties, they started calling them compacts, like the Global Compact for Migration. They started calling them accords, like the Paris Climate Accord. And he was able to pass international treaties by changing the label, using what was essentially the same method as he was using for the executive orders, bypassing Congress, because a treaty, again, would require a two-thirds vote by Congress, by defining it differently. And so when they start using different language, it's not just like calling it a different name. It actually has legal implications. And that's one of the big important things now happening with the change in language. They're not calling it a treaty anymore. Now, in other news, though, a verdict is expected in the New York case against former President Donald Trump, speaking of which. And the judge in the case has issued a ruling that could make a guilty verdict a whole lot easier. I'll be explaining this, though, because it's pretty serious. And also how Trump faced the crowd at the Libertarian Convention and what it means for the 2024 elections. All of this, though, we're going to be going into on EpochTV.com, our uncensored streaming platform that's not afraid to report news as it should be, with truth and integrity. So for those of you watching on YouTube, Facebook, X, or Rumble, come join us on Epoch TV for the rest of this episode. And you'll also get access to our hard-hitting documentaries on topics that actually really matter to this country, like what the heck is happening at the southern border, which I expose in my newest documentary, Weapons of Mass Migration. Speaking of global compacts versus treaties, one of the big driving forces behind the system of illegal mass migration into the United States was an international agreement, technically a treaty, but defined as a compact. It's called the Global Compact for Migration. In this documentary, I go down to Panama, I investigate the United Nations presence there, I investigate the NGO presence there, and more importantly, I investigate the international agreement that is facilitating this, and of course how it works even in the United States, where we go to the US-Mexico border. I go, for example, to the areas where they're dropping off the illegal immigrants, and I show the systems at play behind the scenes that are driving it. I think this is an important documentary because, again, it changes the definition of what we're actually dealing with. Is this an issue of people invading the United States, or is it an issue of our government agreeing to an international compact that is facilitating this that for some reason nobody's really talking about? In my personal opinion, we should be discussing the actual cause of an issue, not the surface form of an issue, right? People, of course, making a big deal about what they see on the streets rather than the policy that created the whole thing in the first place. I believe that this documentary can actually change the discussion so we can actually deal with a discussion on something that could actually fix the problem. Do we want to be part of the global compact for migration or not? This is not about the border wall. This is not about more, people on the border arresting people or processing people. This is about whether we want to be part of the agreement that is facilitating the entire process. Let me show you a trailer for that documentary, and we'll go more into some other stories.
An unrelenting stream of immigration. Non-stop.
According to statistics, around 7.2 million illegal immigrants entered the United States under President Joe Biden alone. They have United Nations facilities here, and the people pushing this are leading people to their deaths.
To what extent is the United Nations facilitating the border crisis?
They're throwing rocks! They're being overridden by international powers.
We are not authorized to talk.
It is a humanitarian business now.
And they said, oh yeah, these are the debit cards. We're giving these debit cards to the immigrants.
Why all the cloak and dagger? Why are we being so stealthy about this?
Some of these people have gone on record and publicly talked about this. People close to Barack Obama.
It puts 12 million people on the path to citizenship and eventually voters.
I've been researching, of course, what's happening, but I want to know why it's happening.
We'll see chaos on a global scale until America is extinguished and the power shifts completely to the east.